once again. This is Classics Cut, and this week we've got a very interesting selection of The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Since it's the month of romance, we thought why not go with a doomed romance story. And without further ado, I suppose we'll begin. Introduction, in which the author of this singular work informs the reader how he acquired the certainty that the opera ghost really existed. The opera ghost really existed. He was not, as long believed, a creature of the imagination of the artiste, the superstitions of the managers, or the absurd and impressionable brains of the young ladies of the ballet, their mothers, the box keepers, the cloakroom attendants, or the concierge. No, he existed in flesh and blood, though he assumed all the outward characteristics of a real phantom, that is to say, of a shade. When I began to ransack the archives of the National Academy of Music, I was at once struck by a surprising coincidence between the phenomenon ascribed to, quote, the ghost, unquote, and the most extraordinary and fantastic tragedy that ever existed in the minds of Paris's upper classes. I was soon led to think that this tragedy might reasonably be explained by the phenomenon in question. The events do not date more than 30 years back, and it would not be difficult to find at the present day, in the foyer of the ballet itself, old men of high repute, men upon whose word one could absolutely rely, who would remember as though they happened yesterday the mysterious and dramatic conditions that attended the kidnapping of Christine Daae, the disappearance of the Vicomte de Chagny, and the death of his eldest brother, Count Philippe, whose body was found on the bank of the lake that exists in the lower cellars of the opera on Rue Scribe side. But none of the witnesses had until that day thought that there was any reason for connecting the more or less legendary figure of the opera ghost with that terrible story. The truth was slow to enter my mind, puzzled by an inquiry that, every moment, was contemplated by events which at first sight might be looked upon as superhuman, and more than once I was within an ace of abandoning a task in which I was exhausting myself in the hopeless pursuit of a vain image. At last I received the proof that my presentiments had not been deceiving me, and I was rewarded for all my efforts on the day when I acquired the certainty that the opera ghost was more than a mere shade. On that day, I had spent long hours over the memoirs of a manager, the light and frivolous work of the overly skeptical Moncharmont, who, during his term at the opera, understood nothing of the mysterious behavior of the ghost, and who was making all the fun of it that he could at the very moment when he became the first victim of the curious financial operation that went on inside the quote-unquote magical envelope. I had just left the library in despair when I met the delightful acting manager of our National Academy, who stood chatting on a landing with a lively and well-groomed little old man to whom he introduced me gaily. The acting manager knew all about my investigations and how eagerly and unsuccessfully I had been trying to discover the whereabouts of the examining magistrate of the famous Chagny case, M. Leroux. Nobody knew what had happened to him, alive or dead, and here he was, back from Canada, where he had spent 15 years, and the first thing he had done on his return to Paris was to come to the secretarial offices of the opera and ask for a free seat. The little old man was M. Leroux himself. We spent a good part of the evening together, and he told me the whole Chagny case as he understood it at the time. He was bound to conclude in favor of the madness of the Vicomte and the accidental death of the elder brother, for lack of evidence to the contrary, but he was nevertheless persuaded that a terrible tragedy had taken place between the two brothers' connections with Christine Daae. He could not tell me what became of Christine or the Vicomte. When I mentioned the ghost, he only laughed. He too had been told of the curious manifestations that seemed to point to the existence of an abnormal being residing in one of the mysterious corners of the opera, and he knew the stories of, quote, envelope. But he had seen nothing in the story worth his attention as magistrate in charge of Shawnee case, and it was as much as had done to listen to the evidence of a witness who appeared of his own record and declared that he had often met the ghost. This witness was none other than the man who all of Paris called the Persian, and who was well known to every subscriber of the opera. The magistrate simply took him for a visionary. I was immensely interested by this story of the Persian. I wanted, if there was still time, to find this valuable and eccentric witness. My luck began to improve as I discovered him in his little flat on the Rue de Vauvoir, where he had lived ever since and where he died 5 months after my visit. I was at first inclined to be suspicious, but when the Persian, with childlike candor, told me everything he knew about the ghost and handed me all his proofs of the ghost's existence, including the strange correspondence of Christine Daae, to do as I pleased with, I was no longer able to doubt. No, the ghost was not a myth. I have, I know, been told that this correspondence may have been forged from the first to the last by a man whose imagination had certainly been fed the most interesting and seductive tales, but fortunately I discovered some of Christine's writing outside the famous bundle of letters, and on comparison of the two, all my doubts were removed. I also went to the past history of the Persian and found that he was an upright man, and capable of inventing a story that might have defeated the end of justice. Moreover, I was of the opinion that more serious people who had, at one time or another, were mixed up in the Shawnee case, who were friends of Shawnee's family, and whom I showed all my documentation and my interferences. In this connection, I should like to print a few lines from which I received from General D. Sir, I cannot urge you too strongly to publish the results of your inquiry. I remember perfectly that a few weeks before the disappearance of the great Seigneur Christine Daae, the tragedy which threw the whole of the Faubourg Saint-Germain into mourning, there was a great deal of talk in the foyer of the ballet on the subject of the ghost, and I believe it only ceased to be discussed in consequences of the later affair and excited to us all so greatly. But if it be possible, after hearing you, I believe, to explain the tragedy through the ghost, then I beg you, sir, to talk to us about the ghost again. Mysterious though the ghost may first appear, this ghost will always be more easily explained than the gruesome story in which malevolent people have tried to picture two brothers killing each other who had worshipped each other all their lives. Believe me, etc. Lastly, with my bundle of papers in hand, I once more went over the ghost's vast domain, the huge building which had made his kingdom. All that my eyes saw, all that my mind perceived, corroborated with the Persian's documents precisely, and a wonderful discovery crowned my labors in a very definitive fashion. It'll be remembered that, later, when digging in the substructure of the opera, preparatory to burying the phonographic records of the artist's voice, the workmen laid bare a corpse. Well, I was at once able to prove that this corpse was that of the opera ghost. I made the acting manager test this proof with his own eyes, and it now has become a matter of supreme indifference to me that the papers presented that the body of the victim was that of the Commune. The wretches who were massacred under the Commune in the cellars of the opera were not buried on this side. I will tell where their skeletons can be found in a spot very far removed from the immense crypt, which during the siege was stocked with all sorts of provisions. I came upon this track while in the act of looking for the remains of the opera ghost, which I should never have discovered but for the great stroke of luck described above. But we will speak again of the corpse and of what should be done with it. For the present, I must conclude the very necessary introduction by thanking Monsieur Milfroid, who was the commissioner of the police called on the first investigation after the appearance of Miss Daae, Monsieur Remy, the late secretary, Monsieur Mercer, the late acting manager, Monsieur Gabriel, the last chorus master, and particularly Madame la Baronne de Castelot-Barbizec, who was once the, quote, little Meg of the story. and who is not ashamed of it. The most charming star of our adorable corps de ballet, the eldest daughter of the worthy Madame Giry, now deceased, who charged the ghost's private box. All these have been of the greatest assistance to me, and, thanks to them, I shall be able to produce those hours of pure love and sheer terror, their smallest details, before any reader's eyes. And I shouldn't be ungrateful indeed if I admitted, while standing on the threshold of this dreadful and various story, to thank the present management of the opera, which has so kindly assisted me in all my inquiries. Monsieur Messenger in particular, together with Monsieur Gabon, the acting manager, and the most amiable of men, the architect trusted with the preservation of the building, who did not hesitate to lend me to the works of Charles Garnier, although he almost sure that I would never return them to him. Lastly, I must pay a public tribute to the generosity of my friend and former collaborator, Monsieur J.L. Croze, who allowed me to dip into the splendid theatrical library and borrow rare editions of books by which he set store. Gaston Leroux.
Chapter 1. Is it the ghost? It was the evening on which Mademoiselle Debienne and Poligny, the managers of the opera, were giving a farewell gala performance to make their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen young ladies of the ballet, who had come up from the stage after dancing. They rushed in amid great confusion, some giving vent to forced and unnatural laughter, others to cries of terror. Sorelli, who wished to be alone for a moment to polish up the speech which she was about to make to the resigning managers, looked around angrily at the mad and tumultuous crowd. It was little James, the girl with the tilted nose, the forget-me-not eyes, the rose-red cheeks, and the lily-white neck and shoulders, who gave the explanation in a trembling voice. "It's the ghost!" And she locked the door. Sorelli's dressing room was fitted up with commonplace official elegance, a pier glass, a sofa, a dressing table, and a cupboard or two provided the necessary furniture. On the walls hung a few engravings, relics of the dancer's mother, who had known the glories of the old opera in the Rue La Pelletier, portraits of Vestris, Gardel, Dupont, Bigatini, but the room seemed a palace to the chits of the corps de ballet, who were lodged in common dressing rooms where they spent their time singing, quarreling, smacking the dressers and hairdressers, and buying one another glasses of cassis, beer, or even rum until the call-boy's bell rang. Sorelli was very superstitious. She shuddered when she heard little Jim speak of a ghost, called her a silly little fool, and then, as she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and the opera ghost in particular, at once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," moaned little James, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped into a chair. Thereupon little Giry, the girl with eyes as black as sloes, hair black as ink, a swarthy complexion, and a poor little skin stretched over poor little bones. Little Giry added, "If that's a ghost, he's very ugly." "Oh, yes," cried the chorus of the ballet girls, and they all began to talk together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes, who had suddenly stood before them in the passage, without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have loomed through the wall. "Pooh!" said one of them, who had more or less kept her head. "You see the ghost everywhere." And it was true. For several months there had been nothing discussed at the opera but this ghost in dress clothes who stalked about the building from top to bottom, like a shadow, who spoke to nobody, to whom nobody dared speak, and who vanished as soon as he was seen, no one knowing how or where. As became a real ghost, he made no noise in walking. People began by laughing and making fun of the specter clad like a man of fashion or an undertaker, but the ghost legend soon swelled to enormous proportions among the corps de ballet. All the girls pretended to have met this supernatural being more or less often, and those who laughed the loudest were not the most at ease. When he did not show himself, he betrayed his presence or his passing by accidents, comic or serious, for which the general superstition held him responsible. Had anyone met with a fall, or suffered a practical joke at the hands of one of the other girls, or lost a powder puff, it was at once put down to the ghost, the opera ghost. Yet who had actually seen him? You meet so many men with dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts, but this dress suit had a peculiarity of its own. It clothed a skeleton, at least, so the ballet girl said. And, of course, it had a death's head. Was all this serious? The truth is that the idea of the skeleton came from the description of the ghost given by Joseph Bouquet, the chef scene shifter, who had really seen the ghost. He had run up against the ghost on the little staircase by the footlights, which leads straight down to the cellars. He had seen him for a second, for the ghost had fled, and to anyone who cared to listen to him, he said, "He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeleton frame. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. All you see is two big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. His skin, which is stretched across his bones like a drumhead, is not white, but a dirty yellow. His nose is so little worth talking about that you can't see its side face, and the absence of the nose is a horrible thing to look at. All the hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks on his forehead and behind the ears." This chief scene shifter was a serious, sober, steady man, very slow at imagining things. His words were received with interest and amazement, and soon there were other people to say that they too had met a man in dress clothes with a death's head on his shoulders. Sensible men, hearing this story, began by saying that Joseph Bouquet had been the victim of a joke played by one of his assistants. And then, one after the other, there came a series of incidents so curious and so inexplicable that the very shrewdest people began to feel uneasy. For instance, a fireman is a brave fellow. He fears nothing, least of all fire. Well, the fireman in question, who had gone to make a round of inspection in the cellars, and who seems to have ventured a little further than usual, suddenly reappeared on the stage, pale, scared, trembling, with his eyes starting out of his head, and practically fainted in the arms of the proud mother of little James. And why? Because he had seen coming toward him, at the level of his head, but without a body attached to it, a head of fire. And, as I said, a fireman is not afraid of fire. The fireman's name was Pampin. The corps de ballet was flung into consternation. At first sight, this fiery head in no way corresponded with Joseph Bouquet's description of the ghost. But the young ladies soon persuaded themselves that the ghost had several heads, which he changed about as he pleased. And of course, they at once imagined that they were in the greatest danger. Once a fireman did not hesitate to faint. Leaders and front row and back row girls alike had plenty of excuses for the fright that made them quicken their pace when passing some dark corner or ill-lighted corridor. Sorelli herself, on the day after the adventure of the firemen, placed a horseshoe on the table in front of the stage doorkeeper box, for everyone who entered the opera other than as a spectator to touch before setting foot on the first tread of the staircase. This horseshoe was not invented by me, any more than any other part of the story. Alas, it may still be seen on the table in the passage outside the stage door keeper's box when you enter the opera through the yard known as the Cour de l'Administration. To return to the evening in question, "It's the ghost!" little James had cried. An agonizing silence now reigned in the dressing room. Nothing was heard but the hard breathing of the girls. At last, James, flinging herself into the furthest corner of the wall, with every mark of real terror on her face, whispered, "Listen!" Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. There was no sound of footsteps. It was like light silk gliding along the panel. Then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than the others. She went up to the door and in a quavering voice asked, "Who's there?" But nobody answered. Then, feeling all eyes upon her, watching her least movement, she made an effort to show courage and said, very loudly, "Is there anyone behind the door?" "Oh, yes, there is! Oh, yes, there is!" cried that little dried plum of Meg Geary, heroically holding Sorelli back by her gauze skirt. "Whatever you do, don't open the door! Oh, Lord, don't open the door!" But Sorelli, armed with a dagger which she always carried, turned the key and drew back the door, while the ballet girls retreated to the inner dressing room, and Meg Geary moaned, "Mother! Mother!" Sorelli looked into the passage bravely. It was empty. A gas flame in its glass prison cast a red and sinister light into the surrounding darkness without succeeding in dispelling it, and the dancer slammed the door again with a deep sigh. "No," she said, "there is no one there." "Still, we saw him," James declared, returning with timid little steps to her place beside Sorelli. "He must be somewhere prowling about. I shan't go back to dress. We had all better go down to the foyer together at once for the speech, and then come up again together." And the child reverently touched the little coral finger, which she wore as a charm against bad luck. And while Sorelli stealthily, with the tip of her pink right thumbnail, made a St. Andrew's cross on the wooden ring which adorned the fourth finger of her left hand, she said to the little ballet girls, "Come, children, pull yourselves together. I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." Yes, we saw him just now," cried the girls. He had a death's head in his dress coat, just as when he appeared to Joseph Gay. "And Gabriel saw him too," said James. "Only yesterday afternoon, broad daylight." "Gabriel, the chorus master? Why, yes, didn't you know? And he was wearing his dress clothes in broad daylight? Who? Gabriel? Why, no, the ghost." "Certainly. Gabriel told me so himself. That's what he knew him by. Gabriel is in the stage manager's office." Suddenly the door opened and the Persian entered. You know, the Persian has the evil eye.
Oh, yes!
Answered the little ballet girls in chorus, warding off ill luck by pointing their forefinger and little finger at the absent Persian, while their second and third fingers were bent on the palm and held down by the thumb. "And you know how superstitious Gabriel is," continued James. "However, he is always polite, and when he meets the Persian, he just puts his hands in his pocket and fetches his keys. Well, the moment the Persian appeared in the doorway, Gabriel gave one jump from his chair to the lock of the cupboard so as to touch iron. In so doing, he tore a whole skirt of his overcoat on a nail. Hurrying to get out of the room, he banged his forehead against the hat peg and gave himself a huge bump. Then suddenly, stepping back, he skimmed his arm on the screen. Near the piano, he tried to lean on the piano, but the lid fell on his hands and crushed his fingers. He rushed out of the office like a madman, stepped on the staircase and came down the whole first flight on his back. I was just passing with Mother. We picked him up. He was covered with bruises and his face is all over blood. We were frightened out of our lives. But all at once, he began to thank Providence that he had got off so cheaply. And then, he told us what had frightened him. He had seen the ghost behind the Persian. The ghost with the death's head. Just like Joseph McKay's description. James had told her story ever so quickly, as though the ghosts were at her heels, and was quite out of breath at the finish. A silence followed. While Sorelli polished her nails in great excitement, it was broken by little Geary, who said, Joseph McKay would do better to hold his tongue. Why should he hold his tongue? Asked somebody. That's Ma's opinion, replied Meg, lowering her voice and looking about her, as though fearing lest other ears than those present might overhear. And why is it your mother's opinion? Hush! Ma says a ghost doesn't like being talked about. And why does your mother say so? Because, nothing. This reticence exasperated the curiosity of the young ladies, who crowded round little Geary, begging her to explain herself. They were there, side by side, leaning forward simultaneously in one movement of entreaty and fear, communicating their terror to one another, taking a keen pleasure in feeling their blood freeze in their veins. I swore not to tell, gasped Meg, but they left her no peace and promised to keep the secret until Meg, burning to say all she knew, began with her eyes fixed on the door. Well, it's because of the private box. What private box? The ghost box! Has the ghost a box? Oh, do tell us, do tell us. Not so loud, said Meg. It's box 5, you know. The box on the grand tier next to the stage box on the left. Oh, nonsense. I tell you it is. Ma has charge of it. But you swear you won't say a word? Of course, of course. Well, that's the ghost box. No one has had it for over a month, except the ghost. And orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold. And does the ghost really come there? Yes. Then somebody does come. Why, no, the ghost comes, but there's nobody there. The little ballet girls exchanged glances. If the ghost came to the box, he must be seen, because he wore a dress coat and a death's head. This is what they tried to make Meg understand, but she replied, that's just it. The ghost is not seen, and he has no dress coat and no head. All that talk about his death's head and his head of fire is nonsense. There's nothing in it. You only hear him when he is in the box. Ma has never seen him, but she has heard him. Ma knows, because she gives him his program. Sorelli interfered. Geary, child, you are getting at us. Thereupon little Geary began to cry. I ought to have held my tongue, if Ma ever got to know. But that's true enough. Joseph Bouquet had no business to talk of things that didn't concern him and will bring him bad luck. Ma was saying so last night. There was a sound of heavy and hurried footsteps in the passage, and a breathless voice cried, Cecile! Cecile! Are you there? It's Ma's voice, said James. What's the matter? She opened the door. A respectable lady, built on the lines of a Pomeranian grenadier, burst into the dressing room and dropped groaning into a vacant armchair. Her eyes rolled madly in her brick dust-colored face. How awful, she said. How awful! What? What? Joseph Bouquet. What about him? Joseph Bouquet is dead! The room became filled with exclamations, with astonished outcries, with scared requests for explanations. Yes, he was found hanging in the third-floor cellar. It's the ghost! Blurted out little Geary, as though in spite of herself, but she at once corrected herself, with her hands pressed to her mouth. No, no, I didn't say it. I didn't say it. All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, yes, it must be the ghost. Sorelli was very pale. I shall never be able to recite my speech, she said. Ma James gave her opinion while she drained a glass of liquor that happened to be standing on the table. The ghost must have had something to do with it. But the truth is, no one ever knew how Joseph became met with his death. The verdict at the inquest was natural suicide. In his Memoirs of a Manager, Monsieur Mochamin, one of the joint lessees who succeeded Monsieur Debienne and Poligny, describes the incident as follows. A grievous accident spoilt the little party which Mademoiselle Debienne and Poligny gave to celebrate their retirement. I was in the manager's office when Brissier, the acting manager, suddenly came darting in. He seemed half mad and told me that the body of a scene shifter had been found hanging in the third cellar under the stage, between a set piece and a scene from Roi de Leroux. And I shouted, "Come and cut him down!" By the time I had rushed down the staircase and Jacob's ladder, the man was no longer hanging from his rope. So this is an event which Monsieur Mochamin treats as natural. A man hangs at the end of a rope. They go to cut him down, and the rope has disappeared. Oh, Monsieur Mochamin found a very simple explanation. Listen to him. It was just after the ballet, and leaders and dancing girls lost no time in taking precautions against the evil eye. There you are! Picture the corpse de ballet scuttling down the Jacob's ladder and dividing the suicide rope among themselves in less time than it takes to write. When, on the other hand, I think of the exact spot where the body was discovered, the third cellar underneath the stage, I imagine that somebody must have been interested in seeing the rope disappeared after it had effected its purpose, and time will show if I am wrong. The horrid news soon spread all over the opera, where James Bouquet was very popular. The dressing rooms emptied, and the little ballet girls, crowding round Sorelli like timid sheep around their shepherdess, made for the foyer through the ill-lit passages and staircases, trotting as fast as their little pink legs could carry them.
Chapter 2. The New Marguerite. On the first landing, Les Sorelli met the Count de Chanel coming up the stairs. The Count, normally so calm, seemed greatly excited. "I was on my way to call on you," said the Count, greeting her with consummate gallantry. "Ah, what an amazing evening! And Christine Daae, a triumph!" "That's hard to believe," said Marguerite. 6 months ago she couldn't seem to save her life. But pray let us pass, dear Count, she added with a cheeky curtsy. "We're on our way to hear the latest about the poor man who has been found hanged." Just at that moment, the administrator, looking flustered, bustled past, but stopped as he caught her words. "What? You girls have already heard?" he said curtly. "Well, keep it to yourselves, and for heaven's sake don't breathe a word of it to Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny. It would be too upsetting for them on their last day." The dancers made for the foyer, which was already packed. The Count de Chanel was right. There had never been a concert like it. Those privileged enough to have been there still talk about it to their children and their grandchildren and thrill at the memory. Imagine, Gouillon, Rayet, Sassien, Massenet, Giraud, and Delibet strode up to the rostrum in turn to conduct performances of their own works. Among the others appearing were Fari and Lacrasse, and it was on that evening that the astounded, ecstatic Paris audience were first introduced to Christine Daae, whose mysterious fate I have yet to reveal in this book. Gouillon conducted a performance of the Marche Fendrée d'une Marionnette. Rayet, the fine overture from his Sigurd. Satsien, la danse macabre, and Arrivée orientale, Massenet at la newly composed Marche Anglaise, Giraud is Carnaval, Delibet, the Valse Lent from Sylvia and the Piscalette from Coppelia. Mille Cross and Denise Bloch had sung the first, the Bolero for the Vepre Sicilienne, and the second, the drinking song from Cruce Borce, and they all died. But the triumph was Christine Daae's alone. She had begun with excerpts from Romeo and Juliet. It was the first time the young artist had performed any of this work by Cugnot, which had not yet been staged at the Opera House. It had just been revived at the Opéra Comique years after it was first performed at the old Theatre Ric by Madame Carval. You could only feel sorry for those who never heard Christine Daae's Juliet, never saw her innocent grace, were never stirred by her seraphic voice, never felt their spirits take wings above the tombs of the lovers from Leroux. Lord, 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 forgive us! But that night was as nothing compared with the stupendous intensity she achieved in the present scene and the final trio of Faust, from which she replaced Carlotta, who was indisposed. No one had ever heard or seen anything like it. That night, Monsieur Daae delivered the new Marguerite, a Marguerite of hitherto hidden splendor and radiance. The whole auditorium erupted, carried away by the euphoria, cheering and applauding a sobbing Gaston, who collapsed in the arms of her fellow artistes. She had to be helped back to her dressing room and looked more dead than alive. The great critic P. de Sitteville preserved the memory of that wonderful night in a piece which he called The New Marguerite. Like the great artist that he himself was, he revealed in the simplest terms what the beautiful, sweet creature had brought to the stage of the opera that night. Not just her art, but her whole heart. Every last devotee of the Paris Opera knew that Christine had stayed as pure as she had been at 15. And P. de Sitteville wrote that to understand the change that has come over Daae, it must be supposed that she has just discovered love for the first time. I am perhaps being indiscreet, he went on, but only love could bring about such a miracle, so overwhelming a transformation. 2 years ago, we heard Christine Daae sing when she auditioned for a place at the Conservatoire. Then she seemed to be a charming prospect. Where on earth did she get the glorious voice she has today? If it need not float down from heaven on the wings of love, I can only conclude that it rose from hell, and that Christine, like the master singer of Offredingen, has signed a pact with the devil. If you had never heard Christine sing the final trio of Faust, you do not know Faust. For exaltation of voice and the sacred rapture of a pure heart, it will never be bettered. But some subscribers protested. Why had such a pearl been kept from them for so long? Until then, Christine Daae had been adequate singing Sibylle to the Marguerite of the emphatically voluptuous Carlotta. It had taken the unexplained and inexplicable absence of Carlotta from the gala concert for Mrs. Daae at short notice to have a chance to rise to the occasion and show what she could do in a part of the program featuring the Spanish diva. Finally, what had made Messieurs Debenay and Poligny think of Christine Daae? Did it mean they had known about her great hidden talent all along? And if they had, why had they kept it hidden? Oddly, she didn't have a singing teacher at the time. Several times she had said that henceforth she would manage without one. It was all very puzzling. The Count de Chanay had been present in his box and had jumped to his feet and joined in the barrage of bravos. Philippe Jouard Marie, Count de Chanay, was then exactly 41 years of old. He was a great noble and a fine-looking man. He was above average height, he had an agreeable face, though his brow was heavy and his eyes were cold. He always behaved with exquisite courtesy to the ladies and was rather aloof with men who were not always inclined to forgive his worldly success. He was considerate and had a conscience. By the death of old Count Philibert, he had become head of one of the oldest and most illustrious families in France. Its aristocratic pedigree dated from the time of Louis Letin. The Chanay fortune was enormous. When the old count, a widower, died, it was no small burden that fell on Philippe's shoulders, that of managing the inheritance. His two sisters and his brother Raoul wanted to be no part of it and refused to allow the state to be divided. They left everything to Philippe, as if the right of the firstborn to inherit had never been abolished. When both sisters married on the same day, they were given their shares by their brother, not as something that was theirs by right, but as a dowry for which they were suitably grateful. The Countess de Chanay, née de Lemoine de la Martinière, had died giving birth to Raoul, who was born 20 years after his older brother. When the old Count died, Raoul was 12. Philippe took an active interest in his education. In this task he was admirably seconded at first by his two sisters, and then by an old aunt, the widow of a naval officer who lived at Brest, and gave young Raoul a taste for the sea. The young man went to the Barde, from which he emerged at the top of his class and duly completed his training by sailing round the world. Thanks to powerful contacts, he had just been selected to take part in the official expedition of the Leroux, which was being sent to the North Pole to look for survivors of the Artois expedition, from which nothing had been heard for 3 years. Meantime, he was to make the most of a long leave which still had 6 months to run. In aristocratic circles, all the dowager ladies noticed this handsome young man and pitied him in advance for the hardships which lay in store. He was exceptionally diffident. I'm almost tempted to say innocent. He seemed to have only just emerged from the influence of women. Indeed, cosseted by 2 sisters and his old aunt, his almost exclusively female upbringing had made him open and honest and given him a boyish charm, none of which had yet rubbed off. At that point, he had just reached the age of 21, but looked 18. He had a small blonde mustache, fine blue eyes, and a girlish complexion. Philippe spoiled Raoul. In the first place, he was very proud of his younger brother and happily predicted a great future for him in the navy, in which one of their forebears, the celebrated Chagny de la Roche, had held the rank of admiral. He used Raoul's leave to show him the sights of Paris, because Raoul knew almost nothing about what the capital had to offer in the way of fine living and artistic pleasures. The Count took the view that at Raoul's age, being a goody-goody was not altogether a good thing. He himself was level-headed, took his pleasures as soberly as he approached his work, always behaved impeccably, and was incapable of setting his brother a bad example. He took him everywhere, even to the foyer of the Cour de Ballet. I know, of course, that people said the Count was very close to La Sorelle, but surely no one would criticize a gentleman who was single, and therefore had lots of leisure time on his hands, especially now that his sisters had been suitably provided for, and begrudge him the right to spend a few hours after dinner in the company of a dancer who might not be particularly clever, but had the prettiest eyes imaginable. Oh, besides, there are places where a true Parisien, when he holds the rank of Count de Chanay, must be seen, and in those days the foyer of the Cour de Ballet was one of them. But maybe Philippe would not have taken his brother backstage at the National Academy of Music if Raoul had not been first, and more than once, to suggest it with a gentle insistence, which the Count would subsequently remember. The night of the concert, after cheering Christine Daae, Philippe had turned to Raoul and was shocked to see how pale he looked. "Can't you see?" Raoul had said. "She's taken ill." It was true. On stage, Christine had been supported. "You're the one who looks like he's about to faint," said the Count, turning to Raoul. "What's wrong with you?" But Raoul was already on his feet. "Come on," he said, his voice shook. "Where are you going, Leroux?" said the Count, surprised by the emotion that had gripped his brother. "Let's go and see what the matter is. She's never sung like that before." The Count stared at his brother, and in his mouth relaxed into a faint, amused smile. "Very well," he said, adding, "Come on then." He looked delighted. Moments later, they were at the entrance reserved for the season ticket holders. It was crammed. As he waited to get through to the stage, Raoul absolutely worried at his gloves. Philippe, who had a kind heart, did not make jokes about his impatience. But now he knew. He knew why Raoul's mind seemed elsewhere whenever he spoke to him, and also why he seemed so keen to bring every topic of conversation back to the opera. They stepped onto the stage. A crush of men in evening dress pushed their way towards the foyer of the Cour de Ballet or made for the performers' dressing rooms. The shouts of the scene shifters mingled with the orders barked by the gaffers. The bustle and hustle of the stage between acts, excerpts from the hand of half finale troop off. Small part dancers barge past you, a flat is moved, a backcloth descends from the flies, a scenery door is hammered into shape, the never-ending "Mind your backs!" rings in your ears, bringing an imminent threat of disaster to your topper or a solid dig in the small of your back. It's uproar, and it never fails to disconcert novices like the man with the small blonde mustache, blue eyes and girlish complexion as he fought his way as fast as he could through the traffic jam and across the stage on which Christine Daae had just returned and beneath which Joseph Bouquet had just died. That night, the chaos had never been so complete, but Raoul had never been less shy. Using his solid shoulder, he brushed aside anybody and anything that got in his way, paying no mind to the comments people made around him, and not even trying to understand what the flustered stagehands were saying. All he wanted was to see the woman whose magical voice had pierced his heart. Yes, he had the feeling that his poor, untried heart no longer belonged to him. He had tried, truly he had, to keep his defenses from the first moment Christine, whom he had known since she was a young little girl, had come back into his life. In her presence he had felt sweet emotions which he had thought about and tried to chase away, for his self-respect and his religious upbringing had made him swear to love no woman except the one who would become his wife. And naturally there was no question he should ever think of marrying a singer. But then those sweet emotions had been followed by a terrible sensation. Was it a sensation? Or was it a feeling? It was half physical, half emotion. He had an ache in his chest, as though someone had cut it open and removed his heart. It felt hollow, as if it were an empty space which could never be filled except by another heart. These are psychological symptoms of a particular kind, which are said to be comprehensible only to those who have been similarly smitten and been struck by that strange lightning bolt come in common commonplace love at first sight. Count Philippe had difficulty keeping up with him. The smile was still on his face. Backstage, as Leroux walked to the double door which opens onto both the stairs that led to the foyer and the steps to the orchestra boxes on the left of the stage, he was forced to give way to a covey of small part dancers who had just swooped down from their dressing room high in the attics and were blocking his path. Saucy remarks were directed at him by painted mouths, but he paid no attention. Eventually he was able to go on his way and proceeded down a dark corridor which rang with the cries of enthusiastic admirers. One name rose above all the rest. Daae! Daae! The Count, who had now caught up, muttered, "The young devil. He knows the way," and wondered how he'd managed it. He'd never taken Raoul to see Christine in her dressing room, so presumably he'd been there by himself while the Count was in the foyer chatting as usual with La Sorelle. She often got him to stay by her side until the moment she made her entrance, and sometimes she made him hold the little leggings she wore on her way down the stairs from her dressing room to make sure that her satin dancing shoes stayed shiny and her flesh-colored tights did not get dirty. La Sorelle always had a good excuse. She had no mother to do it for her. Temporarily cutting off the time when he was due to see La Sorelle, the Count made his way down the gallery that led to Christine Daae's dressing room. He'd never seen the corridor as full of people as it was on that evening when the whole theatre seemed as overwhelmed by the soprano's success as they were shocked by her collapse. Indeed, she had yet to come round. Meanwhile, the house doctor, who had been sent for, now arrived, pushing his way through the crowd with Raoul hard on his heels. The doctor and the lover reached Christine's side at the same time, so that she was greeted by the former and opened her eyes in the arms of the latter. The Count remained by the door with all the others. "Oh, doctor, do you think would be an idea if these gentlemen moved back and cleared the ladies' dressing room?" asked Raoul with surprising boldness. "There's no air in here." "You are absolutely right," agreed the doctor, and he shooed everyone away except for Raoul and the maid. The maid stared at Raoul with an expression of total bewilderment. She had never set eyes on him before. Yet she dared not ask him who he was and what he was doing there. The doctor simply assumed that if the young man behaved the way he did, it was because he was perfectly entitled to. And so Raoul was unable to stay on in Christine's dressing room and watch her regain consciousness, while the two directors, Messieurs Devenier and Poninier, who had come to offer their congratulations, were kept waiting outside in the corridor with the rest of the gentlemen in evening clothes. The Count de Chanay, who had been banished to the corridor with the rest, laughed uproariously. "Of all the cunning! The foxy devil!" he said, adding in an undertone, "You can't trust these callow youths to come over all innocent any further than you can throw them." He beamed and delivered his verdict. "He's a true Chenier!" and headed off towards La Sorelle's dressing room. But at that moment the ballerina was leading her trembling flock down the stairs. It was then that the Count met her on her way up, as we already know. Meanwhile, in her dressing room, Christine Daae gave a deep sigh, which was immediately answered by a soft moan. She turned her head, saw Raoul, and started. She looked at the doctor and smiled at him, and then at her maid, and then at Raoul again. "Oh," she said to him in a small voice that was little more than a whisper, "Who are you?" "I, mademoiselle," answered Raoul, putting one knee on the floor and dropping an ardent kiss on the diva's hand. "I am the little boy who once ran into the sea to rescue your scarf." Christine looked at the doctor and then at her maid, and then all three burst out laughing. Raoul stood up, blushing. "Since you seem set on not recognizing me, I should like to say something to you in private. It's very important." "Perhaps when I'm feeling a little better, if that's all right with you," she said in a voice which shook. "You are very kind." "But you must go now," added the doctor with his most twinkling smile. "Leave me to look after the patient." "I'm not ill," Christine broke in suddenly with a vivacity as strange as it was unexpected. And with a rapid movement of one hand over her eyes, she got to her feet. "Thank you, doctor. I would like to be alone. I want you all to go away, please. Leave me. I'm feeling very tense this evening." The doctor tried to object for a moment, but given the patient's agitated mood, he figured the best treatment for her state was not to cross her. He left with Raoul, who, outside in the corridor, felt very much at a loss. "I hardly recognized her tonight," said the doctor. "She's normally such a sweet-tempered young woman." And off he went, leaving Raoul alone in a part of the theatre which was now completely deserted. By now, everyone should be making their way to the leaving ceremony in the foyer of the Cour de Ballet. Raoul thought that perhaps La Daae would want to be going too, so he waited in the empty, silent corridor. He backed into the shadow of a convenient doorway. He could still feel that aching emptiness where his heart should have been. That was what he wanted to talk to La Daae about, urgently. Suddenly, her dressing room door opened, and he saw the maid emerge alone with a number of bundles. He stopped her as she passed and asked for news of her mistress. She laughed and said her mistress was quite well, thank you, but she doesn't want to be disturbed because she wanted to be left on her own. Then she ran off. An idea flashed into Raoul's fevered brain. It was obvious. La Daae wanted to be alone for him. Hadn't he said he particularly wanted to have word in private, and didn't that explain why she ordered everyone away? Hardly daring to breathe, he crept towards her dressing room, put one ear against the door so that he would hear her reply, and was about to knock, but he let his hand fall. He had just made out, inside the room, the voice of a man, a commanding voice, and it was saying, "Christine, you must love me." Then Christine's pained the voice. You could hear the tears in it, said trembling, "How can you say that? I sing only for you." Cut to the quick, Raoul leaned against the door panel for support. His heart, which he thought was gone for good, was suddenly back in his chest and beating loudly in his ears. The whole corridor pulsated with it, and his ears were almost deafened by the sound. If his heart went on making such a racket, surely someone would hear, open the door, and he would ignominiously be sent packing. How mortifying for a Chenet, caught listening at keyholes. He squeezed his chest with both hands to silence his heart, but the heart isn't the same as the jaws of a dog. Even though when you've got a dog's jaws in both your hands, a dog that just won't stop barking, you can still hear it growling. The man's voice resumed, "You must be exhausted." "Tonight, I gave you my soul, and I am dead." "You have a beautiful soul, my dear," went on the deep voice, "and I thank you for it. No emperor was ever given so great a gift. Tonight, the angels wept." After those words, "Tonight the angels wept," Raoul heard no more. But he did not leave. Instead, as if he feared detection, he went back to his shadowy doorway, determined to stay there until the man left Christine's dressing room. In a single moment, he had just learned the meaning of both love and hate. He knew he was in love. He now wanted to know who he hated. To his astonishment, the door opened, and Christine appeared, wrapped in furs and her face hidden by veil. She was alone. She closed the door behind her, but Raoul observed that she did not lock it. She walked past him. He did not watch her go, but kept his eyes fixed on the door which stayed shut. When the corridor was empty once more, he moved down it. He opened the dressing room door and closed it behind him. He found himself in total darkness. The gaslight had been extinguished. "I know you're in here," said Raoul resolutely. "Where are you hiding?" He spoke the words, keeping his back pressed hard against the door. Darkness and silence. All Leroux could hear was the sound of his own breathing. He was quite oblivious of the fact that his behavior was far more reckless than anyone would believe possible. "You will leave here only when I say so," he cried. "If you don't answer, then you are a coward. But I'll see your face." And he struck a match. The flame illuminated the room. There was no one there. Taking good care to lock the door, he lit the gas lights and the oil lamps. He looked inside the closet, opened cupboards, searched everywhere, felt the walls with clammy hands. He found nothing. "It can't be," he said aloud. "Am I going out of my mind?" He stayed as he was for 10 minutes, listening to the hissing of the gas and the quiet of the deserted dressing room. He was in love, yet it never occurred to him to purloin a ribbon which would enable him to take the fragrance of the woman he loved away with him. Finally he left, not knowing where he was going or what he was doing. There came a point in his mindless wandering where he felt an icy blast strike his face. He was at the bottom of a narrow staircase. Behind him a number of workmen were struggling down the stairs, carrying a stretcher of sorts, covered with a white sheet. "Could you tell me which way is the way out, please?" he said to one of the men. "Just there, squire. Cross the way from where you are there," said the answer. "The door's open, but make way now." Gesturing towards the stretcher, Leroux said without thinking, "What have you got there?" "There," the workman replied, "is Joseph Burkitt. He was found hanging by his neck 3 levels down between a flat and a backdrop from the Rue de Leroux." Leroux stepped back to make way for the procession, noted his respects, and left.
Chapter 3. Why the Managers Resigned. During this time, the farewell ceremony was taking place. I have already said that a magnificent performance had been given by the occasion of the retirement of Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, who had determined to die game, as we say nowadays. They had been assisted in the realization of their ideal, though melancholy program, by all that accounted in social and artistic worlds of Paris. All these people met after the performance in the foyer of the ballet, where Sorelli waited for the arrival of the retiring managers with a glass of champagne in her hand and a little prepared speech at the tip of her tongue. Behind her, the members of the corps de ballet, young and old, discussed the events of the day in whispers or exchanged discreet signals with their friends, a noisy crowd of whom surrounded the supper tables arranged along the slanting floor. A few of the dancers had already changed into ordinary dress, but most of them still wore their skirts of gossamer gauze, and all had thought it the right thing to put on a special face for the occasion. All, that is, except little Jamesse, whose 15 summers, happy age, seemed already to have forgotten the ghost and the death of Joseph Bouquet. She never ceased to laugh and chatter, to hop about the play and play practical jokes until Monsieur Debienne and Poligny appeared on the steps of the foyer, when she was severely called to order by the impatient Sorelli. Everybody remarked that the retiring managers looked cheerful, as is our Paris way. None will ever be a true Parisian who has not learned to wear a mask of gaiety over the sorrows of one's sadness, boredom, or indifference over his inward joy. You know that one of your friends is in trouble. Do not try to console him, for he will tell you that he is already comforted. But should he have met with good fortune, be careful how you congratulate him, for he thinks it so natural that he is surprised that you would speak of it. In Paris, our lives are one masked ball, and the foyer of the ballet is the last place in which two such sophisticated persons as Monsieur Debienne and Poligny would have made the mistake of betraying their sorrow, however genuine. And they were already beaming rather too lavishly upon Sorelli, who had begun to recite her speech when an exclamation from the little madcap of Jamesse broke the smile of the managers so brutally that the expression of distress and dismay that lay beneath it became apparent to all eyes. "The opera ghost!" Jamesse yelled these words in a tone of unspeakable terror, and her finger pointed among the crowd of dandies to a face so pallid, so lugubrious, and so ugly, with two such deep black cavities under the straddling eyebrows, that the death's head in question immediately scored a huge success. The opera ghost! The opera ghost! Everybody laughed and pushed his neighbor and wanted to offer the opera ghost a drink, but he was gone. He had slipped through the crowd, and the others vainly hunted for him, while two old gentlemen tried to calm little Jamesse, and while little Jiri stood screeching like a peacock. Sorelli was furious. She had not been able to finish her speech, and the managers had kissed her, thanked her, and run away as the ghost had himself. No one was surprised at this, for it was known that they were to go through the same ceremony on the floor above in the foyer for the singers, and that finally they themselves were to receive their personal friends for the last time in the great lobby outside the manager's office, where a sit-down supper would be served. Here they found the new managers, Monsieur Armand Macharim and Fermin Richard, whom they hardly knew. Nevertheless, they were lavish in protestations of friendship and received 1,000 flattering compliments in reply, so that those of the guests who feared that they had a rather tedious evening in store for them at once assumed brighter faces. The supper was almost gay, and a particularly clever speech of the representative of the government mingling the glories of the past with the successes of the future caused the greatest cordiality to prevail. The retiring managers had already made over to their successors, and the two little master keys, which opened all of the doors, thousands of doors of the opera house. And those tiny keys, the objects of general curiosity, were being passed from hand to hand when the attention of some guests were diverted by the discovery at the end of the table of that strange, wan, fantastic face with the hollow eyes, which had already appeared in the foyer of that ballet and had been greeted by little Jamesse's exclamation, "The opera ghost!" There sat the ghost as natural as could be, except he neither ate nor drank. Those who began looking at him with a smile ended by turning away their heads, for the sight of him at once provoked the most funeral thoughts. No one repeated the joke of the foyer, and no one exclaimed, "There's the opera ghost." He himself did not speak a word, and his very neighbors could not have stated the precise moment in which he sat down with them. But everyone felt that if the dead did ever come sit at the table of the living, they could not cut a more ghastly figure. The friends of Fermin Richard and Armand Moncharin thought that this lean, skinny guest was an acquaintance of Debienne's or Poligny's, while Debienne and Poligny's friends believed that the cadaverous individual belonged to Fermin Richard and Armand Moncharin's party. The result was that no request was made for an explanation, no unpleasant remark, no joke in bad taste, which might have offended the visitor from the tomb. A few of those present who knew the story of the ghost and the description of him given by the chief scene shifter, they did not know of the death of Joseph Bouquet, thought in their own minds that the man at the end of the table might easily have passed for him. And yet, according to the story, the ghost had no nose, whereas the person in question had. But Monsieur Moncharin declares in his memoirs that the guest's nose was transparent, long, thin, and transparent, are his exact words. I, for my part, will add that this might very well apply to a false nose. Monsieur Moncharin may have taken for the transparency what was only shininess. Everybody knows that orthopedic science provides beautiful false noses for people who have lost their noses naturally or as the result of an operation. Did the ghost really take a seat at the manager's supper table that night, uninvited? And can we be sure that the figure was that of the opera ghost himself? Who would venture to assert as much? I mention the incident not because I wish for a second to make the reader believe, or even try to make him believe that the ghost was capable of such a sublime piece of impudence, but because, after all, the thing is possible. Monsieur Armand Moncharin, in chapter 9 of his memoirs, says, "When I think of this first evening, I cannot disassociate the secret confided to us by Monsieur Debienne and Poligny in their office from the presence at our supper table of that ghostly person whom none of us knew. What happened was this. Monsieur de Bien and Poligny, sitting at the center of the table, had not seen the man with death's head, and suddenly began to speak.
The ballet girls are right, he said. The death of that poor Bouquet is perhaps not as natural as people think.
De Bien and Poligny gave a start. Is Bouquet dead? They cried.
Yes, replied the man, or the shadow of a man, quietly. He was found this evening hanging in the third cellar, between a set piece and a scene from Roy de Lahore.
The two managers, or rather ex-managers, at once rose and stared strangely at the speaker. They were more excited than need have been. That is to say, more excited than anyone need be by the announcement of the suicide of a chief scene shifter. They looked at each other. They both turned whiter than the tablecloth. At least De Bien made a sign to Monsieur Richard and Montcharin. Poligny muttered a few words of excuse to the guests, and all four went to the manager's office. I leave Monsieur Montcharin to continue the story.
Monsieur de Bien and Poligny seem to grow more and more excited, he says in his memoirs. And they appeared to have something very difficult to tell us. First, they asked us if we knew the man sitting at the end of the table who had told them of the death of Joseph Bouquet, and when we answered in the negative, they looked still even more concerned. They took the master keys from our hands, stared at them for a moment, and advised us to have new locks made with the greatest secrecy for the rooms, closets, and presses that we might wish to have hermetically closed. They said it so funnily that we began to laugh, and to ask if there was indeed thieves at the opera. They replied that there was something worse, which of course was the ghost. We began to laugh again, feeling sure that they were indulging in some kind of joke that was intended to crown our little entertainment. Then, at their request, we became serious, resolving to humor them, and entered into the spirit of the game. They told us that they would never have spoken to us of the ghost if they had not received formal orders from the ghost himself to ask to be pleasant to him and to grant any request that he might make. However, in their relief at leaving a domain where the tyrannical shade held sway, they hesitated until the very last moment to tell us of this curious story, which our skeptical minds were certainly not prepared to entertain. When the announcement of the death of Joseph Bouquet came and to serve them as a brutal reminder of that, whenever they had disregarded the ghost's wishes, some fantastic or disastrous event may be brought back to them to some sense of their dependence. During these unexpected utterances, made in a tone of the most secret and important confidence, I looked at Richard. Richard, in his student days, had acquired a great reputation for practical joking, and he seemed to relish the dish which had been served to him in this turn. He did not miss a morsel of it, though the seasoning was a little gruesome because of the death of Bouquet. He nodded his head sadly while the others spoke, and his features assumed the air of a man who bitterly regretted having taken over the opera, now that he knew there was a ghost mixed up in the business. I could think nothing better than to give a servile imitation of his attitude of despair. However, in spite of all of our efforts, we could not, at the finish, help bursting out laughing in the faces of Monsieur de Bien and Poligny, who, seeing us pass straight from the gloomiest state of mind to one of the most outrageous merriment, acted as though they thought that we had gone mad. The joke became a little tedious, and Richard asked, half seriously and half in jest, "But after all, what does this ghost of yours want?" Monsieur Poligny went to his desk and returned with a copy of the lease. The opera lease begins with the well-known words setting forth that the management of the opera shall give to the performances of the National Academy of Music and Splendor that becomes the first lyric stage in France, and ends with clause 98, which says that the privilege can be withdrawn if the managers infringe the conditions stipulated in the lease. This is followed by the conditions, which are 4 in number. The copy produced by Monsieur Poligny was written in black ink. It was exactly similar to that in our possession, except that at the end it contained a paragraph in red ink and in a queer, labored handwriting as though produced by dipping the hands of matches in the ink. The writing of a child that has never gone beyond downstrokes and has not yet learned to join in its letters. This paragraph ran, word for word, as follows.
5. Or if the managers in any month delay more than a fortnight the payment of the allowance which he shall make to the opera ghost, an allowance of 20,000 francs a month, say 240,000 francs a year.
Monsieur Poligny pointed out with a shaking finger to the last clause, which he certainly did not expect. Is this all? Doesn't he want anything more? Asked Richard with the greatest coolness. Yes, he does, replied Poligny. And he turned over the pages of the lease until he came to the clause specifying the days on which certain private boxes were to be reserved for the free use of the President of the Republic, the ministers, and so on. At the end of the clause, a line had been added, also in red ink.
Box 5 on the grand tier shall be placed at the disposal of the opera ghost for every performance.
When we saw this, there was nothing for us to do but to rise from our chairs, shake our two predecessors warmly by the hand, and congratulate them on thinking of this charming joke, which proved that only the French sense of humor was never likely to become extinct. Richard added that he now understood why Monsieur Debienne and Poligny were retiring from management of the National Academy of Music. Business was impossible with so unreasonable a ghost. Certainly, 240,000 francs are not to be picked up for the asking, said Monsieur Poligny, without moving a muscle of his face. And have you considered what the loss of Box 5 might do to us? We did not sell it once, and not only that, but we had to return the subscription. Why, it's awful. We really can't work to keep ghosts. We prefer to go away. Yes, echoed Monsieur Debienne. We prefer to go away, so let us go. And so he stood up, and Richard said, But after all, it seems that you and me are too much and too good to be the ghost. If I had such a troublesome ghost as that, I should not hesitate to have him arrested. But how and where? They cried in chorus. We have never seen him. But when he comes to his box, we have never seen him in his box. Then sell it. Sell the opera ghost's box. Well, gentlemen, you try it. And thereupon, we all four left the office. Richard and I had never laughed so much in all of our lives.
And that, folks, sets up the board. All the pieces are there, and this little story is about to start making a few little moves, most of which you probably know from other more famous adaptations. But should you be interested in the original and various details that are quite different, I suggest picking up a copy at any one of our locations. We have some enlarged printed and original, as well as digital online options on Hoopla and Cloud Library. This has been the Classic Cut. My name is Robert Tobias.
My name is Emma.
I'm Will,
And I am Mike.
and we're cutting you out. Classic's gone.